Police officers of Reddit who have arrested other police officers. What's the story?
Not a police officer, but I worked as a contractor for law enforcement's digital evidence lab. There was a new guy who had just retired as a cop but came on because he wanted to do computer forensics and supposedly had some background in it. We were in training together, learning about cell phone forensics, when he missed a day of training. That night, he was on the news because he had been arrested after cops closed in on him for soliciting texts and pictures from underage girls. We weren't part of the investigation but did send his work computer over to the lab that was working on it, and he had content on it. Overall, we were all shocked but also couldn't help but chuckle at the irony that he was a computer forensics analyst who didn't know how to hide evidence on a computer. Domestic violence. Not much of a story, pretty clear-cut. Luckily, it was a visiting family, so not someone I knew. Other than that, I once tackled a guy who was fighting in a bar and threw cuffs on him, only to find out later that he was a cop. I should have known when he immediately put his hands behind his back when I told him to, instead of trying to fight me as drunks tend to do. I detained but didn't arrest him because I didn't actually see him punch anyone, and disorderly conduct has a lot of discretion involved, and I don't know who started it. I gave both parties the information needed to file charges against the other, and a report was completed. Just a reminder that an arrest is not supposed to be a punishment. Being charged with a crime is the issue. I think DUI is the most common, but I never did much traffic enforcement. Not sure if it counts exactly as asked, but I've got a background in law enforcement. As an Army officer recovering from combat injuries, I found myself as the operations officer for a post-based department of emergency services, which included the MPs and law enforcement for the post. My office was across the hall from the actual MP director's office. He stepped in and asked how busy I was. I was busy but wanted any excuse to get away from the monotonous BS I was working on. So I said, "Screw it. What do you need, sir?" He was handling a case personally and wanted another officer as a witness in documentation and processing. An officer's wife had been convinced to come in by a couple of other officer wives. She was a battered mess. Her face was swollen, and even though she cleaned herself up, she was hard to look at without just getting upset. Female officers, of course, did the actual inspections and physical documentation, but the director was running the investigation himself. He had called the officer in off patrol and confronted him with me present as a witness. The dude tried joking it off that he just got drunk and a little out of control. Long story short, his case was transferred to a civilian police department for her good, not from reprisals or anything, but for benefits. He was convicted of DV, which put him out of the MPs and lost him his ability to own or carry a firearm. So he was also discharged from the military, losing his career. I believe he also served some time in a civilian jail, but not sure. She was granted a divorce, and because we sent it to a civilian court and he was not court-martialed, she still got to keep divorced spouse married for over 10 years benefits for her instead of losing all benefits, which is why it was transferred to a civilian department. I really like that director. He did not tolerate BS from among his officers. Not a cop yet, yes, I know, but this is a hilarious story. The city police department had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s, and one of the two female officers was having trouble with it. She had spent an hour screaming, hitting, and yelling at it before pulling out her gun and shooting it. The other female officer, who was my sister's future mother-in-law, had to take her down and arrest her for unlawful use of a service weapon and destruction of municipal property. The charges were dropped because she asked if she could quit instead, also with the conditions of losing her pension and benefits and going to therapy. Now she's been living life as a grandmother and helping kids with anger issues. Another issue, this time though more serious, an officer from the same PD was charged and convicted of unlawfully manufacturing and selling firearms. He was building rifles and pistols and was using a pawn shop to help sell them because they had an FFL, Federal Firearms License, and was forcing the owner to sell him parts for a cheaper price. He was also found to be selling the drugs he took off of people. The police department has taken so many hits from these incidents that the city forces them to have multiple cameras in the cars. All officers have to have body cams they can't turn off unless they're going to the bathroom. They also can't have their guns directly on them at their desks. They have to be locked in a safe next to their desk to deter them from pulling it out and shooting a computer. I guess I've decided to not work there and find employment with a department that has a better reputation. which sadly is hard. My friend worked as a cop at a local city. He told us a story of how he was nearly arrested by a cop when he was a cop. He and 3 of his fellow officers were having a night of drunken antics related to a bachelor party. At one point, while definitely intoxicated, his friend decided it was a good idea to throw a hot dog covered in mustard and ketchup at a uniformed officer from a neighboring town. Direct hit to the back of the head. Everyone was silent for a second. Then the officer came over and started angrily talking to them. None of them could keep their composure because, well, the alcohol and the fact that condiments were dripping down this cop's neck as he spoke. Needless to say, they were thrown in the drunk tank but never formally charged. I was the head of the unit dealing with intimate offenses and child protection. We served a number of police precincts called a cluster. A young woman was arrested for theft at one of the police stations that resided under us. Her mother was the complainant. The daughter had a serious substance addiction and had previously stolen from her mother, who gave her a last warning after the second to last time. A substantial, for them, amount of cash had gone missing, and when confronted by her mother, the daughter denied any knowledge of it. So, deciding that it was time for tough love, she took her daughter to the police station, opened a case, and had her arrested. Later that evening, the mother discovered that instead of hiding the money in the inside pocket of the coat which she was hanging in her wardrobe, she had inserted the envelope containing the cash into a coat sleeve. In other words, there was no theft. She immediately returned to the police station, explained to them what had happened, made a withdrawal statement, and was told her daughter would be released imminently, but that because the case docket was already with the detectives, only they could release her, not the police in the charge office. Enter the rotten apple of a detective. Upon hearing that a withdrawal statement had been made, he booked the suspect out of the cells and took her to his office where he told her that he could make the case go away if she did something nice for him in return. He then talked her into having sex with him, following which he released her from custody. Only upon returning home and hearing her mother's profuse apology did the daughter realize what had happened. Cue the assault complaint, the case docket of which ended with me. Long story short, we summarily arrested the detective, a seasoned veteran of more than 15 years' service, recovered the used condom in his office, and he was convicted. I don't remember the exact sentence, but it was in excess of 10 years. This is one of the most disgusting abuses of power, just straight up taking advantage of a suspect. I once had a call to arrest an off-duty officer for DUI. It sucked all around. The guy had been on the force for over 20 years and was well-liked, but there was no getting around the fact that he was wasted and had plowed his car into a tree. He didn't argue or try to get out of it, but you could see the shame and disappointment in his eyes. He ended up resigning before the disciplinary process even started. That one hurt because he was always a good cop. I'm a police officer, and my department had to arrest one of our own for child pornography. The guy was in his late 40s and was a well-respected member of the force. It was a shock to everyone. The investigation was done by an outside agency to avoid any conflicts of interest, and they found a lot of evidence on his home computer. He was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. It was a sad day for all of us, but we all agreed that he deserved to be punished. Not a cop but a CO, corrections officer. I worked in a state prison, and we had a former cop who was serving time for murder. He had killed his wife in a fit of rage. He was actually one of the better inmates, very respectful and kept to himself. It was always weird thinking about how he was once on the other side of the law. One day, he told me he didn't feel safe and asked to be put in protective custody because other inmates had found out he was an ex-cop. I had to follow protocol and write him up, but we got him into protective custody that same day. Not a cop but worked security with off-duty officers. One of the guys I worked with regularly was always really chill, always telling stories about his time on the force. One day, he just didn't show up for his shift, and we found out later he had been arrested for domestic violence. Apparently, he had been abusing his wife for years, and she finally had enough and called the police. It was shocking to everyone because he never showed any signs of being that kind of person. He lost his job and ended up serving time. I'm a cop, and I had to arrest a fellow officer for domestic violence. It was a tough situation because we had been friends for years. His wife called 911 after he had been drinking and got violent. When we arrived, she had visible injuries, and he was still angry and aggressive. There was no way to avoid it. We had to take him in. He ended up losing his job and his family over it. It was a real wake-up call for a lot of us about how serious domestic violence is. I had to arrest a fellow officer for drug possession. He was a great cop, always going above and beyond, but he had a secret addiction to painkillers. He got caught with a significant amount of pills that weren't prescribed to him. It was a tough situation because he was well-liked, and no one had any idea he had this problem. He ended up getting help and eventually got his life back on track, but he never returned to the force. Had to arrest a fellow officer for DUI. He was off-duty and crashed his car into a parked vehicle. When we got there, it was clear he was drunk. He tried to talk his way out of it, but there was no way we could let him go. It was a hard decision, but he had to be held accountable just like anyone else. He lost his job and went through a rough patch, but eventually got sober and found a new line of work. I'm not a cop, but my dad was. He had to arrest a fellow officer who was caught stealing evidence. The guy was taking drugs from the evidence locker and selling them. My dad was part of the investigation and was the one who had to put the cuffs on him. It was hard for him because they had been partners for years. The guy ended up going to prison, and it really affected my dad. He always told me that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. I once arrested a fellow officer for assault. He had been at a bar, got into a fight, and beat someone up pretty badly. When we arrived, he tried to use his badge to get out of it, but the victim was in rough shape, and witnesses confirmed he was the aggressor. We had no choice but to take him in. He was charged and eventually fired. It was a tough situation, but he crossed the line, and we had to do our job. Had to arrest a cop from another department for shoplifting. He was off duty and got caught stealing some electronics from a store. The store security called us, and when we arrived, we recognized him. He tried to downplay it, saying it was a mistake, but the security footage was clear. We had to arrest him. He ended up losing his job and had a criminal record because of it. It was a sad situation, but he made his choices. Not a cop, but I was a military police officer. I had to detain a fellow MP for sexual assault. He had assaulted another service member after a party. The investigation was swift, and the evidence was clear. It was hard to believe because he was someone we all trusted, but we had to take action. He was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. It was a reminder that no one is above the law, and we have to hold each other accountable. I once got arrested by another officer while I was off duty. I was new to the department and went out with some friends for a night of fun. We ended up in a part of town I wasn't familiar with, and I got caught out there when a severe storm hit, and the dirt roads turned to mud. We all ended up getting stuck. When we eventually got back to the base, we were covered in mud and a bit late. I was stopped by an MP who immediately started hassling me. I was respectful and explained the situation, but he decided to arrest me for insubordination and failure to follow an order. The charges were eventually dropped because it was seen as a misunderstanding, but it was a frustrating experience. A cop I know arrested another cop for assault. The arrested cop was known to have a short temper, and one day, he got into a heated argument with his girlfriend in public. It escalated quickly, and he ended up hitting her. The officer who made the arrest was a rookie and didn't know the guy personally, so he just followed protocol and arrested him on the spot. The veteran cop ended up losing his job and served some time for the assault. I was a cop in a small town and had to arrest another officer for drug possession. He was one of the most liked guys in the department, always smiling and cracking jokes. But one day, during a routine traffic stop, he was acting nervous. We searched his car and found a small bag of cocaine. It was a tough situation because everyone liked him, but the law is the law. He was fired and went to rehab after the incident.